We begin today's shiur at the Mishnah that you'll find 11 lines from the top of the Omid. On the side of our Gemara we have a topic heading. We call this a nosei, and in parentheses we add klali, a general topic heading. Mayim sheyesh or she'ein lohem sof. This is a concept that will become clear as we go through the Gemara. We're dealing with a situation where someone drowned, and we touched on this in our previous shiur, and the question is, can we assume that the person is dead, and hence the wife will become, of course, a widow and be able to marry someone else? The Mishnah, Nofal Lemayim, a man fell into water, Bein Sheyesh Lohen Sof, Bein She'ein Lohen Sof. Whether it's categorized as water that has an end, and of course, as we said, the Gemara will explain this term, whether it's mayim that doesn't have an end, Ishtoi Asura, the wife is considered married. She remains also prohibited to marry someone else. In other words, we cannot assume just because we saw a man go under that he is dead. Omar Rebbe Meir, Maisa be'echad shenafal lebor hagadol, was an incident where someone fell into a large pit. The olah liachar shloshi yomim, and he arose 3 days later. Of course, you can't assume that a person lives underwater for 3 days, so something must have happened, and you can see from here that just because you see someone fall into the water and that's it, you can't assume that he is necessarily dead. Omar Rebbe Yossi. Rebbe Yossi, we will see, disagrees with the Tanakama and is matir the woman in a case of mayim sheyesh lohem sof. Maisa besuma shiyorad litbol b'maora. There was an incident of a blind man that went to immerse himself in a me'ora. Me'ora is a cave that had water in it. And we add here, this is an example of mayim sheyesh lohem sof. V'yorad moshchoi acharav, and the individual who led him followed the blind man. V'shohu kidei shetetzei nafsham, v'siu es neshoseim. The men did not come out. The suma and the leader, the guide, did not come out, and Rebbe Yossi allowed their wives to remarry. V'shuv ma'aseh be'Asya. Asya is the name of a place. An incident in Asya. Be'echad sheshil shiluhu liyam. They lowered him into the sea below. Also biyodam elo raglo, and they hauled up the rope, and all that came up with it was his leg. Omru chachamim. This is a point, of course, that we saw in our previous shiur. Minho arkuvo lamalo tinasei. If what you hauled up with the rope was his leg, including the area above the knee, then it's a sign that he is dead, and she can remarry. Minho arkuva ulamato lo tinasei. However, if it's from below the knee, that which was hauled up, she cannot remarry. Tonu Rabbanan. Nofal Lamayim, a man fell into water, Bein Sheyesh Lemself, Bein Shein Lemself, Ishto Asura, Divrei Rebbe Meir. This is the opinion that we saw in the Mishnah as well, the Tanakama. That's Rebbe Meir. Rebbe Meir is the first opinion. V'chomim oimrim, Mayim Sheyesh Lohem Soif, Ishto Muteres, V'she'ein Lohem Soif, Ishto Asura. And the Chachomim make a distinction between these two types of waters. And now finally, Heichi Dami Mayim Sheyesh Lahem Sof. As we said, the Gemara will deal with it, and here it is. What is meant by water that has an end? Omar Abaye, Kol She'oimed V'roye Me'arba Ruchoisav. If it's a body of water that you can, from where you stand, you can see all four sides. In other words, you can see the shoreline, the banks of the body of water from all four sides. So very simply, if a man went into the water and you're looking around and you wait a few minutes, a couple hours, and you don't see anyone coming up, so he's drowned. That is the case when you're dealing with mayim sheyesh lohem soif. When you're dealing with mayim she'ein lohem sof, so you don't see what's going on at all extremities. So if you see someone go in, and from where you're standing you don't see him coming up, but you also don't see the shoreline, you don't see the end of the water. Maybe some strong current carried him far away, far off, beyond your eyesight, and he was saved. He found some flotsam or whatever, and he was able to survive. That's in the case of mayim she'ein lohem sof. And now we continue in the Gemara with a maisi. You can see it lasts a number of lines. Hahu gavra, there was a man, de tova be'agmo de samki. He drowned in this body of water called agmo de samki. Rashi says, agam is a lake, shel oisa mokim. Agam, and then Rashi quotes a French word to explain that. Oimed b'mekoime v'einom mayim chayim. It's water that's stagnant. It's not flowing water. So it's, as a result, if it's non-flowing in nature, kemayim sheyesh lohem soif domu. It's then viewed as water that does have extremities, that you can see the ends of it. She'enu yochol loshut al pneihem l'merachok. He can't float on them too far. Hilkoch im isa desolik have a lay. If he had gone out, if he had arisen, you would have seen it. So we have a person that went under in this agmo de samki, and Rashi clearly said this is an example for our purposes of mayim sheyesh lahem soif. Ansevo Rav Shilo lidvisu. Rav Shilo enabled his wife to, this man who drowned, this man's wife, to remarry. Omar le Rav l'Shmuel ta neshamte. Let us excommunicate Rav Shilo. He was upset with Rav Shilo's ruling. Omar le, so Shmuel sends back to Rav, nishlach le bereisha. Before we excommunicate him, let's check out. Let's ask him some questions, and before we come to some type of rash sentence against him. Sholchu le, they asked him, mayim she'ein lahem soif. Ishto asura muteres. Now, we had explained, and based on Rashi, of course, that one might have viewed that lake as a result of what Rashi said, that there was no current in there, so it's considered like mayim sheyesh lohem sof. However, I don't know if we can say that that's the last word on the matter. So we continue in our Gemara. Shmuel says, let's ask Rabbi Shilo some questions before we censure him. Mayim she'ein lohem sof. Ishto asur muteres. In the case of mayim she'ein lohem sof, where you don't see all the banks, is the wife muteres, or is she asura? When we say muteres, that means, are we to assume then that the husband is dead? Sholach lehu, Rav Shilo answered, Ishto asura. When you're dealing with mayim she'ein lohem sof, the woman, of course, remains forbidden. We don't know what happened to the husband. He might have been saved. The agmo de samki, they asked Rav Shilo, agmo de samki, mayim sheyesh lohem sof or mayim she'ein lohem sof? How do you categorize the agmo de samki? And now what the Gemara is doing is we're asking Rav Shilo that question. Sholach lehu mayim she'ein lohem sofu. So Rav Shilo innocently responded, well, the agmo de samki, it's a very large lake, you can't see all the banks, so it's mayim she'ein lohem sof. Well, humar my time over hachi. So then why did you allow her to remarry? So the Gemara answers, mit'ah ta'ina, I made a mistake. Hano safri, I thought, kevon dekavu v'kaimi, since the water is stagnant, kemayim sheyesh lahem soif dami, it should be categorized as yesh lahem sof, v'loi hi. And really, that's not true. Kevon deika goli, since there are waves, there's no current. It doesn't flow with a current like the river, but it has waves in it. Amor Goli Ashpeloi. It could be that one of these waves picked up the man and carried him off far away, and he got out. He walked out on the shore at that distant point. Kori Shmuel Olei de Rav. Now, at this point, of course, then you see that Rav Shilo didn't act in a malicious fashion, and his ruling wasn't some type of premeditated act of anti-halacha. He admits that he made a mistake, and therefore there's no reason to censure him. So Rav was prevented by punishing an innocent man. Kori Shmuel Olei de Rav. Shmuel proclaimed concerning Rav the following verse: Lo yunu l'tzadik kol oven. Rashi says, Lo yunu l'tzadik kol oven shelo boso takol lezu liyodu sherav lindoisis Rav Shilo. That the pasuk says that the righteous, the tzaddik, lo yune kol oven, no evil shall befall the tzaddik. In other words, the evil in this case would have been the censuring of an innocent man. So Shmuel referred to Rav as a tzaddik, a pious, a righteous man, and he saved from that pitfall. Kori Rav Olei de Shmuel, and Rav referred to Shmuel the following pasuk: Utshua beroiv yoetz. Salvation comes through increased counsel. And the fact that I took advice from Shmuel, I listened to his advice, I was saved. Tanya, Omar Rebbe, Maisa b'shnei b'nei Adam mechamrin michmorim b'yardei. It was an incident involving two, we can call them fishermen. These are fishermen, they fish by spreading out nets in the water. V'nichnas echad mehem lemechila shel dogim. One of the men went into a mechila shel dogim, a type of tunnel or cave in which the fish gather. There's a Rashi lemechila shel dogim shechoitetim somach l'sfas hanor bein lamato min hamayim bein lamala min hamayim begoiva sfasoi. They carve out, the fish carve out a type of cavern or cave in the we'll say the river's banks, or the walls that form the banks of the river. This cave-like structure is partially above the water level, partially below the water level. The ein mismalis kula, it doesn't get filled with water completely. The adam anichnas sham magbiat savoro b'soch hamora. A man who enters this cavern can lift his head above the water, l'malam min hamayim, and be able to survive. So you have these fishermen. One of them went into this mechila shel dog v'shoka chama, and the sun set v'lo ra pischa shel mechila, and it was dark and he couldn't find the exit from this cavern. V'shah chaveru kidei sheteitze nafsho. The other fishermen waited enough time that a person who would be underwater would die. Ubava hodia b'soch beiso. And he went and informed the household, the wife of this fellow. L'mochar zorcha chama v'hikir pischa shel mechila. The next day, the fellow who had entered that cavern found the exit point. After the zorcha chama, the sun shone forth, and he recognized the entrance to the cavern. Uba umotza hesped gadol b'soch beiso, and he went home and saw a large eulogy taking place in his house. Omar Rebbe. Rebbe then noted, how great are the words of the sages. Shamru mayim sheyesh lahem soif, ishto muteres. She'en lahem soif, ishto asura. The distinction that the Chachamim made is so wise, so that when you have a case of mayim she'en lahem soif, the woman is assumed to still be married. You don't know for sure that the husband is dead. and that was the case over here when you're dealing with a river. So you can't see all the banks. You can see two of the banks maybe, but you don't see the other extremities. The Gemara says, if that's the case, then Mayim Sheyesh Lem Sof Nami, how can you say in Mayim Sheyesh Lem Sof that the wife is considered a widow and she's muteres, she's allowed to marry out? Nami there to Lechush Lemechilo Shel Dogim, in a relatively small body of water, like a small lake where you can see all the sides. Maybe even if you don't see the man come up, shouldn't you consider the possibility of a mechila shel dogim, that he went in there and he raised his head above the water level? You didn't see him. You who are standing outside on the banks, you don't see him coming up. Why then do you say that in Mayim Sheyesh Lohem Soif the woman is considered a widow and she's muteres? The Gemara answers, B'Mayim Sheyesh Lohem Soif, in these kinds of bodies of water, we're called small bodies of water, Mechila Shel Dogim Lo Shlicha. It's uncommon to find a fish cavern, and since it's uncommon, if you see a man go into the water and not come out after waiting a reasonable amount of time, how long can a person survive underwater? You can then assume that when you don't see him come up, that he is dead. Omar Ravashi, Ha di Omru Rabbanan, Mayim She'ein Lehem Sof Ishto Asura. That which the Rabbanan said regarding Mayim She'ein Lehem Sof, that the wife remains forbidden, Hani Mili Be'inish Dalma. That's true when she's married to a common individual. Avol Tzur B'Merabanan Lo. But if she was married to an outstanding Talmud Torah sage, then we wouldn't say that the wife is Ozer Yidesolik if he had risen from the water. Kola Islay. It would have created a publicity. Literally, it would have created a noise. People would know about it. People would talk about it. So that if the Tzur Rabbanan fell into Mayim She'ein Lehem Sof, and we don't hear about him anywhere, it must be that he's dead. Veloihi, the Gemara rejects this analysis. Loishno inish de alma, veloishno tzum rabbanon. Makes no difference whether it's a commoner or a Torah scholar. Di'eved in l'chatchila lo. If the woman remarried, so we would say she can stay remarried, but we certainly would not allow her to. We wouldn't allow her initially to remarry. We have a new marking, a crown shape, and on the side of the Gemara, under the Mivneh heading, we've written Shnei Braisos im Maisim Doimim Be'inyan Hatzola Mechashash Tviyah B'Yam. We have two Tanaic sources with similar type stories where we find a person saved from drowning. The double underline highlights a phrase that's common to both sources, V'yisi mitztayar al talmid chacham sheba, where in the first story involving Rabbi Gamliel and the second was Rabbi Akiva, they were upset, concerned with a Talmud Chacham that was on a sinking boat. The Gemara. Tanya, Amar Rabbi Gamliel, Pam achas hoyisi malech b'sfina. Once I was traveling on a boat, for isi sfina achas shenishbara, and I noted there was another boat that had broken. For isi mitztar al talmid chacham sheba, and I was upset because there was a Torah sage on that other boat. We'll call it the sinking vessel. Umanu, and who was that? Rabbi Akiva, and the Rabbi Gamliel was expressing his sentiments that what a shame that the great Torah sage Rabbi Akiva is going to be no longer. And when I reached the shore, says Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Akiva appeared and we started to converse in Torah learning. Omarti lo b'ni mi helcha. So Rabbi Gamliel addresses Rabbi Akiva and says, well, who saved you? Who brought you up? Omar li, and Rabbi Akiva answered, Daf shel sfinon is damid li. Daf is a board. Appropriately for those of us who are learning Gemara, there's some type of symbolism here. We refer to a daf of Gemara. That Torah learning saves us from all types of troubles and travails. But here we're dealing with the literal meaning of the Gemara. And Rabbi Akiva says a plank from the boat, made of wood, it floats. It chanced upon me, and every wave that threatened to drown me, nanesi lo roshi, I bent my head and enabled the wave. I didn't confront the wave head on. I bent over and thereby spared myself from imminent danger. There's a great deal of symbolism and hints and remozim in this particular Maisa, where the Rabbi Akiva is describing how we should be, how the Jewish people should deal with the affliction that the Gentiles of the world afflict upon the Jewish people throughout history. And the counsel that he's really giving us here is, you don't confront the enemy head on. You have to know how to humble yourself and to accept different types of gzeros and thereby survive. Of course, there's much more to talk about on this particular topic. You can see this featured in the commentaries. In the meantime, though, once again, going back to the straightforward meaning of the Gemara, each wave that came upon me, I bent over. Mikan omru chachomim, and here you see the Gemara itself refer to what we just alluded to. Im yavo rishoyim al odam, when the wicked come upon a person, yenanea lo rosho. Know how to humble yourself. Don't confront them head on. Omarti, ba'isasho, kama gdolim divrei chachomim. And Rabbi Gamliel says that I said to myself, how great are the words of the sages. Shomru mayim sheish lam sof muteres. When a married man drowns in mayim sheish lam sof, so the woman is considered muteres. She's a widow. If when you, of course, notice that the fellow doesn't come up, mayim she'ein lahem sof, as was the case involving the sea on which Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Akiva had been sailing. Asura, the woman remains Asura. You can just imagine here, Rabbi Akiva was on a sinking boat, and the boat sank, and Rabbi Gamliel could have easily concluded, well, no more Rabbi Akiva, and his wife is now a widow, she can remarry. But of course, it's Mayim She'ein Lahem Sof, and one should not reach that conclusion, and you could see how, in fact, Rabbi Akiva was saved. Tanya, we have a very, very similar story, just change of names. Amar Rabbi Akiva, Pam Achas Hoyisi Mahalach B'Sfina. Now Rabbi Akiva is describing how he was once traveling on a boat. V'Isi Sfina Achas Shemitarefes Bayam, and I saw a boat that was having great difficulties at sea. Mitarefes, being cast about in the water. It was going to sink. V'Isi Mitztal Talmud Chacham Shebo, and I was concerned, I was upset because of the Talmud Chacham that was on that troubled boat. Umanu, and who was that Talmud Chacham? Rabbi Meir. Shalisa Medinas Kaputya, and when I arrived in the country of Kaputya, Rabbi Meir came and started to converse with me in Torah learning. Amarti lo b'ni mei helcha, and I asked him, so who saved you? Amar li gal tardani lechavero v'chavero lechavero. There was a wave that came and picked me up and cast me from one to another, ad shehikiani liabosh, until eventually I was cast upon the shore. Amarti v'isasha, and I said, so Rabbi Akiva says at that moment, Kama Gedolim Divrei Chachamim Shomru, how great are the words, how insightful are the words of the sages that said, Mayim sheish lahem sof ishto muteres, Mayim she'ein lahem sof ishto asura. Before we continue in the Gemara, we glance at the side. We have a topic heading. The Nosei reads, Nefila Legov Aroyos, someone who falls into a lion's den. L'kuli alma ein me'idim alav. According to all opinions, Just because you saw a man fall into a lion's den, that does not mean that the man is dead. A person can live. However, falling into a pit that contains venomous creatures like snakes and scorpions, there we'll see a Tanaic controversy about reaching conclusions concerning his survival. We turn back to the Gemara. Tonu Rabbana Nafal Legova Royos Ein Me'idin Olav. A man falls into a lion's den. We do not testify that he is dead. L'chafura Maleo Nechoshim V'Akravim, into a pit filled with snakes and scorpions. Me'idin Olav. In that situation, we can testify he is dead. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Omer Af lechafurim le'anechoshiv akrovim ein me'idin alav. Even into that situation, we will not testify about his death. Chayshinon, we suspect. We continue at the top of Omid Beis. Shemo chaborhu. Maybe he is an enchanter, and he knows how to snake charm and keep these venomous creatures away from him. V'Tanakama. What about the Tanakama? Doesn't he take that into consideration, that the man might have had this skill? So he says, Agav itzitza mazki lei. Because of the initial impact when he fell in, that would have, aroused these creatures, and they would have stung him or bit him at that initial moment. Now, this is in contrast to the lion's den, which is a wide area, and falling into that doesn't necessarily create the same vibration and impact that is in the case of the Chafur Shel Nechoshim Nakrovim. It's a wide area, and at times these carnivorous creatures are not hungry, and therefore they wouldn't necessarily consume him. Tonu Rabbanan. Before we continue in the Gemara, we have on the side a nosei topic heading: Ha'im me'idim al odom. Do we testify concerning a person? Testify about his death. Shenofa lekivshano eish, fell into a furnace of fire. Yoyre melea yayin shemen, a cauldron filled with boiling wine or oil. Now the Gemara. Tonu Rabbana Nofal l'soich, man fell into kivshano eish, a furnace, me'idin olav. We can testify that he did not survive. L'yoyre melea yayin v'shemen, me'idin olav. If he fell into a cauldron full of hot wine or oil, we can testify about his death. Now Rashi adds, we're dealing with a cauldron that's boiling on a fire. However, as we said in our introduction, there is a machlokes, or maybe we didn't say it straight out, but there is a machlokes. Rav Acha Mishum Rabbi Acha Amru Shel Shemen Me'idin Olav V'Pnei Mavir Shel Yayin Ein Me'idin Olav Meishu Mechabet. The halacha said in the name of Rav Acha was such that we make a distinction between oil and wine. A cauldron of oil sitting on the fire, when a person falls into that, so some of the oil will splash out and reach the fire underneath, and when oil comes into contact with fire, it actually increases the strength of the fire, and therefore the person is considered dead. As opposed to falling into boiling wine on a fire, when wine splashes out of the cauldron into the fire, it actually extinguishes the fire, and with that reduced heat, a person could conceivably survive. Omru lo, the Chachomim who disagree with Rav Acha responded, said Tchilasa mechabe v'sofo mavir. Initially, the fire appears to die down. However, a little while later, it actually gets stronger. Therefore, you can't rely on the splashing of the wine to reduce the heat. Omer Rabbi Meir, Ma'aseh be'echad shenafal lebor hagadol. A man had fallen into a pit and he arose 3 days later. On the side, we have a topic heading where we've written Hezber HaMachloikis Rabbi Meir v'Chachamim be'inyan echad shenafal lebor hagadol v'olo le'achar gimel yomim, concerning this incident of someone who fell into a large pit and came up after 3 days. The Gemara continues, Tanya Omru Lo Rabbi Meir Ein Mazkirin Ma'aseh Nisim. The Chachamim who were Machmir said you can't, or I should say the Chachamim who were Mekil. The Chachamim's opinion was that if you fall into a pit, you're considered as good as dead. A pit full of water. The Rabbi Meir he shared this incident showing that even though he fell into the pit, he came up after 3 days. So, Omru Lo Rabbi Meir, Ein Maskirin Ma'aseh Nisim. Rabbi Meir, they said to Rabbi Meir, who wanted to prove from here that the man cannot be assumed to be dead, they said, you can't cite miraculous circumstances to support your position. My Ma'aseh Nisim, what's the miraculous aspect of that was in this story? If it's that he didn't eat nor drink, and of course not eat nor drink for 3 days, and then that's a miracle of survival. Well, but there's a pasuk that says regarding Esther in the Purim story, Vitsumu olai v'al tochlu v'al tishtu shloishes yomim laila v'yom. The pasuk says that in fact, the Jewish people fasted 3 days and 3 nights, no eating nor drinking, and they survived. Elo, so what's the miracle? Delo nayim, that he was able to survive 3 days with no sleep. Tiyomer Rabbi Yochanan, Shavua shelo ishan shlosh yomim. If a person were to swear, I am not going to sleep, and he says for 3 days, Malkin oisoi v'ishan la'alter, we impose lashing upon him for taking a vow that cannot be fulfilled, and he has to go to sleep immediately. The point is that there is no possibility of remaining awake for 3 days, and therefore the survival of this man for 3 days in a situation where he couldn't have slept and yet survived, that's miraculous. For Rabbi Meir who thought that this shows that a person, even though it's Mayim Sheyesh La himself, a person could survive, and we can't assume that he's dead. Rabbi Meir, my taima, what about this issue of the miraculous aspect? How can you use this as a basis of proving halacha? So Omar Rav Kahana, Kifin al Gav Kifin Havu. Rashi explains, Kifin al Gabi. Kifin is kamin binyonim v'ulomois, some types of structures that were there in the water. V'nishan aleim v'yashin. He was able to rest upon them and sleep. For Rabbanan, the Rabbanan who did not use this story as a basis of concluding halacha, they said it was miraculous. The Shisha Havu, those kifin that was just described, were made of marble. They were very smooth. You couldn't have possibly rested upon them. You would have slipped right off. Rabbi Meir's response to that is, there was no miracle there. He efshir delo masrich v'nayim purta. It's impossible that he didn't cling even momentarily and doze off for a moment, and that would have been enough to keep the person going. The Gemara continues with a topic heading on the side, the Nosei, Maisa, the Nechunya Choyfer Shichin, V'HaKodesh Baruch Hu Medaktek Im Svivav. We'll see a story involving this person whose name is Nechunya, the well digger. And the Gemara will also report that the Almighty, when dealing with the pious, deals with them in this world sometimes in a very strict, demanding, uncompromising fashion. Tonu Rabbanon. There was a story involving this man. He's known as the well digger because he took upon himself to ensure a constant water supply for all the people coming on the thrice-year pilgrimage to Jerusalem. As Rashi says, it was Chayfer Shichen L'Oile Regolim. The Oile Regolim are the people that come to Jerusalem on Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkos. Umayim, Miskansin, and water would accumulate in these pits. Vayushoisen, Hain, Ubehemton. The people, the travelers, and their animals would have a water supply from which to drink. So there was a story where the daughter of this man, Shenoflu Labor HaGadol, she fell into a large pit full of water, and then they informed Rabbi Chanina about this incident, this seeming tragedy. Shah Rishona Omar Lehem Shalom. The first hour, a person can swim, they can float. So he said, she's still okay, don't worry. Shnia Omar Lehem Shalom. The second hour, 2 hours went by, he said, don't worry about her, things are okay. Shlishis Omar Lehem also. 3 hours went by, and he says she has come out. At 3 hours, a person couldn't possibly survive in a pit full of water, and at this point, Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa says she's come out. Omar Law Biti Mihalech. I guess the Gemara didn't say so explicitly, but after Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa said she came out, so in fact she did come out, and then he asked her, who saved you? Amra Loi, Zocher sherechelim nizdamin li v'zokein manhigoi. Rashi says that this Zocher sherechelim is a ram, it's a male sheep, it's a ram. This is a reference to the Elo Shel Yitzchak, the ram that was present at the time of the Akedas Yitzchak, when Yitzchak was placed on an altar by his father Avram Avinu, and as the story is well known, was not slaughtered, but there was a ram that was slaughtered in its stead. So it's this ram appeared, and the elderly man that was leading it was Avram, and that's what saved me. Could very well be that in the merit of the Akedas Yitzchak and the Schusim of Avram, so she was saved. Amru lo Noviata. They asked Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, "Are you a prophet? How did you know all of this?" Amar Lahem lo Novi Anochi v'lo ben Novi Anochi. I'm not a prophet. I'm not the son of a prophet. Elo dover shat tzadik misasek boy yikoshel bozaro. And the very thing that the pious man, her father, Nechunya Chayfer Shichin, he dug pits to be filled with water. Should his seed, should his daughter, his children suffer in that very thing? That can't be. Omar Rebbe Abo Afal Pikain Mace Beno Batsoma. Even so, his own son died of thirst. The Tosfos points out that even though this is a matter of water, which is something that Nechunya was involved with, nevertheless the son, he died, but he didn't die because of a pit that was made. Therefore, this doesn't contradict the principle that Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa stated in the source. So, nevertheless, even though we saw that Nechunya Chayfer Shichin merited having his daughter saved from her fall into the pit, nevertheless his own son eventually died from thirst. Shnemar, and if you'll explain how can that be? Here you have such a righteous man and he should suffer such a major tragedy. So we explain that as follows: Usvivov nisaro ma'oid. Those that are around, that are around the Almighty, that are close to God, the righteous ones nis'ara ma'oid. Malamed shagosh baruch hu medaktikim svivav kechut hasayra. This tells us that the Almighty is scrupulous, is we'll say practically is unyielding. Medaktik is someone who is very concerned with every minute detail. So Kodesh Baruch Hu treats svivav, those that are around him, that are close to him, with judge them with, as we would say, a fine-toothed comb that combs hair. So kechut hasayra means like with the fine detail, like a strand of hair. Rabbi Chanina Omar Mehocha. The same concept, though, is learned from the following pasuk: Kel narotz b'soy kedoshim rabba v'nura al kol svivav. The exalted, glorified Almighty is awesome, is full of awe concerning all those. We should say that there's an aura of awe upon all those that are surrounding him. In other words, the Almighty is uncompromising, as maybe we'll say fearsome, concerning those that are in his immediate vicinity. Now, of course, all of this has to be understood on the backdrop that the main reward that awaits the righteous is in the world to come, and that by experiencing, we'll say, harshness of din in this world, so the tzaddikim are thereby spared of having to suffer the much more intense suffering that awaits sinners in the world to come. So that it appears on the surface that it's a raw deal. Here they're very righteous and they're being judged very harshly, but quite the contrary. This is the idea, and it's a firm fundamental principle in Jewish theology, that the main place of reward and punishment is in the world to come, and therefore it's ultimately to the benefit of a tzaddik. We don't wish this on anybody because it's an extremely difficult test to be able to withstand. That what often happens when people are put to a very tough test, it often people break and end up sinning as a result of circumstances that they can't handle, that they feel they can't handle, and therefore we don't wish this on anybody to be exposed to this. However, when you do see this taking place, it shouldn't rattle one's faith even for a second, because of the explanation that we attempted to share. We continue in the Gemara with the new Mishnah. We're dealing here with sources of testimony concerning the death of a man. Afilu shoma min hanoshim, even if you hear from women that were speaking without the intent to actually testify. They were speaking on their own. In Hebrew, the term is mesichos lefi tuman, and Rashi uses that expression. They were speaking innocently on their own, and they were saying, Meis ish ploni, so-and-so died. Dayo, that's enough. Rav Yehuda Omer, afilu shoma min hatinoikos oimrim, even if you heard children saying, Harei anu hochem lispoy v'likbor es ish ploni, we're going to eulogize and bury so-and-so. Bein shu miskavein, bein sheinu miskavein. Whether they have intent to testify or they don't have intent to testify, they're just telling a story, you can rely on them. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava Omer, b'Yisrael, afapishu miskavein, when it's a Jew who's telling us that so-and-so died, even if he is speaking with intent to testify, and certainly if he's simply telling a story innocently, we can rely on what the Jew says. When it comes to an idol worshipper, im hoya miskavein ein eduso edus. If an idol worshipper tells us with intent to testify that so-and-so is dead, we don't accept his testimony. In the Gemara, we saw reference made to children that proclaimed, we're on our way to eulogize and bury so-and-so. V'dilma lo asli, maybe they're not really going, or they're not going there. Omar Rav Yehuda, Omar Shmuel. The Ko'amri, part of their story is as follows. Hareinu bo'in milispod umilikvor es ish ploni. We are coming back from a eulogy and from the burial of so-and-so. And the Mishnah that said Harei anu holchim really means we're on our way home from the eulogy. So it's post facto. So, and then the Mishnah says you can rely on that story. The Gemara asks, how can you really rely on that story? The Dilma Kamtsu Be'alma Shachivle. Maybe these children happen to have a pet grasshopper, and the pet grasshopper died. V'asikule al shmei, and they had called their pet by the name of so and so. If their neighbor was Charlie, and they called their grasshopper Charlie, and they were referring to they're saying that we came back from the eulogy and burial of Charlie. There's really was a reference to their grasshopper, not their neighbor. The Ko'amri, the children, were also telling us why is it that we're able to rely on them, because they said Kain v'Kain Rabbonon Havu Hasam, Kain v'Kain Savdoni Havu Hasam. They tell us so and so great rabbis were there, and so eulogizers were there. With all that added information, it's clear then that they're not referring to their pet grasshopper of recent memory. On the side of our Gemara, we have a topic heading Edus Goy, the testimony of an idol worshipper. We'll speak about Niskavin Lahatir, where he has intent through his words to see to it that the woman, the widow, is able to remarry. Niskavin Lohid, or a case where his intent is to testify about so-and-so's death. And a third situation is Mesiach Levituma, where the goy, or the idol worshipper, is simply telling a story. He's innocently telling a story without any pre-knowledge of our interest in what he is saying. Omar Rav Yehuda, Omar Shmuel. Loi shanu, that which the Mishnah taught that we do not rely on his testimony. Lo shanu elosh niskavein lahatir. This is only if it's clear from the guy that his intention is to see to it that the woman marries someone else, to matir, to allow her to marry someone else. Then we don't rely on the goy. If his intention is to testify, to provide us with this information, he has this intention of telling us, of informing us of so-and-so's death, you can rely on that. Heichi Adinan, how can you distinguish? Omar Rav Yosef, Baal based in Omar. If the Gentile, the idol worshipper, came to the court and said, Ish ploni meis, hasiu es ishto, so-and-so's dead, let his wife remarry. That's an example of someone whose intent is to see to it that she is allowed to marry someone else, and that's what we don't rely on. Meis, stam, if he comes into court saying that so-and-so died without adding anything about the fellow's wife, zehu niskavein li'edus. This is an example of his intent to testify. Itmar nami, Omar Reish Lakish. Likewise, Reish Lakish said, Lo shanu elosh niskavein lahatir. The prohibition of accepting his testimony is only when it's clear that his intent is to see to it that she marries out. And of course, we're suspicious of some type of evil intent in the idol worshipper's interest in seeing her messed up. When the husband's not really dead and he claims he's dead, marries someone else in the meantime and really mess up things. Avol niskavin lahoid edus o edus. Omar lei Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan reacts to Reish Lakish, says, Lo kach hoyamaisa boishaya bribi shetiram im shmoinim v'chamisha zakenim. Is it not so that there was an incident involving the great Rabbi Oshaya, this heter was in order to allow a woman to remarry based on the testimony of an idol worshipper, and the heter was together with shmoinim v'chamish zakenim, with 85 sages. Omar lohem, and he said to them, Lo shonu elo sheniskavin lahatir. That which we were taught, that you cannot rely on a Gentile's testimony, is only where his intent is to see to it that the woman remarries. But if the intent is simply to testify, then you can rely on what he says. But the Chachamim didn't accept that. Rather, even when he has kavanah lahoyid, you cannot rely on the idol worshipper's words. So that's Rabbi Yochanan's objection to Reish Lakish, that the lo hodu l'chachamim, the rabbis did not accept this distinction. Rather, just like niskavin lahatir, you cannot rely on him, niskavin lo also you cannot rely on him. The Gemara asks, Elo masnisin dekotoni, our Mishnah that says ubeoivei koichavimim hoya miskavein ein eduso edus. If he has intent, then his testimony is not reliable. Heichi mishkachas law. Where can you have a situation where he doesn't have kavana to testify and not to matir? In other words, the Mishnah says that regarding idol worshippers, there is a chance of your accepting what he says. However, if it's with kavana, lahoid or lahatir, then you can't. What other options are open? The Gemara answers there is. B'mesiach lefi tumo, where you hear an idol worshipper telling a story on his own, without any intention of revealing the man's actual status, but rather he's telling a story, and part of the story is the information that the man died, but that wasn't his intent. This is a situation called Mesiach Lefi Tumo. Mesiach has to do with the word Sicha, where he's talking Lefi Tumo in an innocent, unaware fashion. So information that you can cull from such speech, so a story that you can accept. And we have triangles that feature Maisim on the side of our Gemara. We indicate Maisim de Bohem Hoyu Mesiach Lefi Tumo. Stories where you see this principle or this phenomenon revealed. Ki, the Gemara continues, Ki Ahuda Havakomar. Also, there was an idol worshipper that was saying, Man Iko Be Chivoi. Chivoi is the name of a person. Who's in Chivoi's house? Man Iko Be Chivoi. Shochiv Chivoi. Rashi says, Man iko bei chivoi, mi me'anshe beisoi shel beis chivoi, who here is from the house of chivoi, shishma devorai de shochiv chivoi. They should hear that chivoi is dead. Well, upon hearing this, v'ansevo Rav Yosef enabled chivoi's wife to remarry. Hahu dehavakomar v'ozer, there was an idol worshipper saying, Vai le parsha zariza. Parsha is a horseman, a warrior that rides on horses, and in this case he's referring to a Jewish fellow that was a horseman, and he was saying, woe unto the so-and-so horseman. Zariza means diligent one, to have a pupadisa deshachav, that was in pupadisa that died. Ve'ansevo Rav Yosef itemo rova lidvisu. And Rav Yosef, in some versions have it as Rova, enabled the wife of that Parsha, that Jewish Parsha, to remarry. Hahuda v'komer vazil, there was a Gentile that was saying, Maniko be Chasa, who here is from Chasa's house, Tova Chasa, you should know Chasa died. Omar Rav Nachman, well, Lukim, Achlu kavri lechasa. He said in exclamation, alakim is an expression indicating an oath or something of a fervent exclaiming. The fish must have eaten chasa. Midibure de Rav Nachman, from Rav Nachman's claim or exclamation, Ozlot Visu de Chasa, the wife of Chasa went, the Insiba v'lo amru lo v'lo midi. She went and remarried, and no one objected, no one said anything. Omar Rav Ashi Shma Mina Ha di Amur Rabbanon Mayim Shein Lam Sof Ishto Asura. That which has been said, that the water that doesn't have any bounds, the case that we spoke about at the beginning of our shiur, Mayim Shein Lam Sof, the woman is prohibited, Hanimili Lechatchila. That's only if one asks, what should she do? As a first choice, we would say she should not remarry. Avol I nosiv lo mafkinon lo minei. But if she remarries, so we don't insist that she leaves the second husband. And that's what you saw in this story from the woman having heard this. She went and got married on her own, and no one said anything after that. Ika the Amri, another version of this story is Ansiva Rav Nachman Lidvisu. Rav Nachman enabled her to remarry. Omar, and Rav Nachman explained, Chasa Gavaraba Isay. Chasa was a great man. Imisa the Solik, if it were that he was saved, that he got out, Kola Islay Lamilsa, it would have been known. And since there was no word about Chasa's coming out, therefore, even though it's Mayim She'en Lo himself, but it involves a Gava Rabbah, a great man, she is allowed to remarry as a first choice. However, the Gemara doesn't accept that. Velohi, and that's not so. Lo Shno Gava Rabbah, Lo Shno Lav Gava Rabbah. There is no difference whether he is a great man or not, or a common man. The evidin lechatchila lo. Only post facto would we say she can remain with the new husband, but not as a first choice, not as an initial ruling. We would not allow her to remarry. There was once an idol worshipper that said to a Jew, I want you to cut. Aspasta is a type of vegetation, it's growth that animals eat. It's actually grains before they fully develop. I want you to cut the aspasta and throw it to my animals on Shabbos. Vilo, and if you don't cooperate, katilna loch, I'll kill you. Kide katilna leploni by Israel, like I killed so-and-so, some Jew, the Amrile, that I had told him, Boshil Likdera b'Shabbos, I want you to cook up some food for me on Shabbos, below Boshili, the Katil say, and he didn't cooperate, and I killed him. Shamot Visu, the wife of that fellow, who had been threatened, who had been forced to cook up the food and did not cooperate. So the wife of that individual heard this story. She came to Abaye saying, this guy was just fuming at his mouth and it indicated in his story that he killed my husband. So can I remarry? Shahisa, we continue at the top of Kuf Chof Beis, Tlosa Rigli. Shahisa means Abai he delayed. The word Shahisa means he delayed. In other words, he did not answer the question immediately. He delayed Tlosa Rigli for the passage of 3 Rigli. Now, there are a couple of commentaries on what Rigli is, but Rashi says it's basically 3 holidays during which there are public drushes. When Pesach comes, so there are drushes held regarding the laws of Pesach and regarding the other holidays. So he delayed it for these 3 holiday periods, and the hope being that in the course of time the question could be clarified. What is her status? Omar Law Rav Ada bar Ava. Rav Ada said to the woman, Zil Kameh de Rav Yosef, the Chorif Sakina. You should take your question to Rav Yosef. He is a very sharp knife. He's very incisive. He'll have an answer for you. Oslo Kameh, so she took her problem to Rav Yosef. Poshat Meha Disnan, Meha Masnisa, and he resolved it from the following Tanaic source. An idol worshipper who was selling fruits in the marketplace, V'yomar, and he proclaimed Peros Halolu Shel Orlohain, Shel Azikohain, Shel Neteravaihain. These fruits are from the first 3 years of the tree. It's a fruit-producing tree. During the first 3 years, the fruits are called Orlo, and they're considered more delectable than fruits from an old tree. Or he says Shal Azikahain. There are a couple of pshatim on what that might mean. Rashi says it comes from a place that's an orchard that's fenced in, and it was a Shemitah year. But Rashi doesn't like that pshat so much, and he suggests another pshat. Azika is a place in Eretz Yisrael that produced very fine fruits. We have to add that if this goy, this Ovid Kechavim, is from Chutz La'aretz, saying that these come from Azika, a place in Eretz Yisrael, so the question is, do I have to suspect then that the fruits haven't been tithed as is required of fruits coming from Eretz Yisrael? And he might claim these are fruits from the 4th year of a tree's life, and fruits from the 4th year, there's an obligation to take the fruits to Jerusalem and eat them there, or redeem them and use the money in Jerusalem. Anyway, the Goy is making these claims about his fruits. He's attempting to boast about his fruits, and in the course of doing so, he's also telling us about the nature of the fruits. It's Orla, it's Azika, as Rashi says, they haven't been tithed, they're from Eretz Yisrael, and then we have to assume maybe they were not tithed. We have to revise. Loi Omar Klum. Now this is the main point. All of those words of the Goy is of no value, it's of no significance, has no halachic ramifications. Lo niskavein lo hashbiach mekho. His intention simply was to advertise how great his produce is. So that when he said they were Orla, they're not really Orla, and when he says they come from that place in Eretz Yisrael with the great fruits, it's not really from there. Now, taking this approach and applying it to the threatening goy that we saw at the bottom of Omid Aleph, so Rashi fills in the story. You can see we have a little star in the Rashi. I'm reading from that point. V'hocha nami lo niskavi levikovim zel ayim al zeh sheitzulu mispo lebein moisav. With the story that he was telling the Jew that he's right now threatening if he doesn't cut some plants for his animals, and as part of the threat he says, and if you don't cooperate, I'll kill you like I killed so-and-so. That story about his killing so-and-so never happened. He said it only to enhance his threat, but as far as actually having killed so-and-so who supposedly didn't cook up the food for him, that never happened. So, as a result of this, then it just, as far as the woman is concerned, who thought that maybe she has a chance to remarry, not so. We continue. Abba Yudin Ish Seiden Omar. And we should point out, by the way, with another marking on the side of the Gemara, we have our Nosei Mivneh, and the diamond is featured along with a double underline. Oid Shloisha Maisim in Mivnim Domim. There's another 3 stories with similar structures. Binin Goy Mesiach Lefitumo, involving a Goy who is telling us a story. So Abba Yudin Ish Sidon Omar, Abba tells us a story. Ma'aseh b'Yisrael v'Ovid Kacham Shocha B'derech. Was a Jew and an idol worshipper walking along on the road. Uba Ovid Kachavim v'Omar, and an idol worshipper came along and said, Chaval al Yehudi Shahoya Imi Baderech Shemes Baderech Ukvartiv. Woe! It's woeful, it's shameful on so-and-so Jew that was with me on the road that died and I buried him. V'hesiu ishto. And they enabled his wife to remarry. V'shuv ma'aseh b'kolar shel b'nei Adam. And there was another incident with a kolar, as a group of people, shehoyu mahalchim antuchya. They were on their way to a country called Antuchya. And an idol worshipper came along and said, Chaval al kolar shal b'nei Adam shemesu kvartim. Woe unto that group of people, of course of Jews, that were on the road and they died and we buried them. V'hesiu es nishosem. And with that, they enabled the widows to remarry. V'shuv ma'aseh b'shishim b'nei Adam shemahalchim lekarkum beitar. There was another incident of 60 people on their way to Karkum Beitar. Karkum Beitar is a situation where Beitar, was the name of a city, was under siege. Ubo oivei kachav v'yomar. And an idol worshipper came along and said, Chaval al shishim b'nei Adam shemahalchim b'derech Beitar. Woe unto those 60 men that were on their way to Beitar, shemesu ukavartim, they died and we buried them. V'esiu es nishosem, and they enabled the wives to remarry.